Welcome to the IT Matters Podcast, where we explore why IT matters and matters pertaining to IT. Here's your host, Aaron Bock.
Welcome, everyone, to the IT Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Bock. I'm joined today by Mike Privette, CISO of Passport Parking here in Charlotte. Mike, how you doing?
Good, Aaron. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one. I've been anxiously awaiting this one for a little while. Before we get into today, just for the listeners out there, in case you hear a massive amount of rain or potentially thunder, it looks like we're about to get poured on today, and I'm sitting right next to a window. So if you hear some noise in the background, it might be that. So stay safe for all of you guys out there about to get hit with this, you included, Mike.
Yes, thank you. I'm also right in front of a window.
Yes. So you might hear it on Mike's side as well. But yeah, so Mike, I guess tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. You're currently the CISO at Passport. Previously, you were at BB&T, which is now Truist. And before that, tell the listeners your story and what you do on the side. You're also an entrepreneur. So I think it'll be good for them to get to know you.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, currently CISO at Passports. Been there about 8 months now. So building out their whole security program. And Passports all over the U.S. and Canada as a mobile parking company. And also they do tickets and enforcements and really just kind of enabling digital well-being for cities. And so like the more digital and more equitable a city is, like the better people live. And so it's a really cool kind of mission.
It's the beginning of 1984, right?
Yes. Although I think we have a better, like more altruistic goal. And
not control people's lives by parking.
Not control people's lives. We just want you to just pay us some money, and then we can help you do all kinds of stuff. But yeah, so like prior to that, I spent most of my career in financial services, large financial services, some of the biggest banks like Wells Fargo, Wachovia, First Citizens Bank, BB&T, now Truist. Also had a 3-year stint at MetLife, which was gigantic company. Really got some awesome global experience there. But I've always kind of been around the highly regulated spaces, mostly in finance. And so coming to Passport was kind of a subversion of that, because we're a payments company. Like we facilitate payments. It just so happens that you're paying for parking, or you're paying for a ticket or a citation if you parked incorrectly, or you're paying for a permit and giving you the ability to go somewhere. So it's a pretty natural fit in terms of the regulatory concerns, the compliance concerns, but also, being able to bring in some of the more structure from a larger company who's like way more established and has more people, and building, program from the start. But, on the side, I've had many entrepreneurial kind of stints, which I truly love. I jokingly tell people my hobby is monetizing my hobbies. So I like to find just fun ways to make stuff. And so, but the one I like the most and kind of works best with my day job is my newsletter. So it's security funded, and that is, I track cybersecurity funding and M&A events every week and just kind of summarize the news. And it's been fun to kind of just show that and watch it grow. But it helps me kind of stay on top of what's happening in the market, and also helps me see, places I should be looking at closer. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, and Mike's being humble. He's got a shirt on that says Miss Lifts. On the many ventures he does, he also deals with strength on the side, and this is one of his brands for strength lifters and power lifters. So, but yes. Yeah, and for those of you out there, we'll put this in the show notes, but here at Opcala, one of the things we do is we evaluate upcoming vendors, new vendors, and Mike is in his writing and return on security and security funded. It's an early source for those looking in the security realm of what's happening, why, who's being funded, what are big companies buying. So Mike, thanks always for sharing those. And we'll get actually back to that in a little bit. I want to go back. So kind of to kick us off in IT Matters, we talk about what are IT Matters and why are IT Matters. Before we get there, you're a CISO now. You've always kind of been in security, but maybe tell everyone, did you start out in out of college or high school, knowing you were going to go into security, or did it happen by accident, or, were you in IT before, or what?
Yeah, it was really by accident. So I came out of college right when Sarbanes-Oxley was huge, the whole Enron scandal and mismanagement of financial controls. And so there was quickly a global concern around IT systems that move money and people who have access to them. So I started off out of college as a consultant at a public accounting firm, doing IT stuff. And when I say stuff, I mean like I would rack and stack a server one day, I configure a firewall the next day, I do a Sarbanes-Oxley audit the following day, make a VBA app because that's how old I am. But, we do custom Visual Basic for applications, apps in Excel. I'm using the term app lightly, but so it was, but like I kind of had a niche there in banks because many of their customers were banking clients. When you start asking about basic IT controls, there's a lot that compliance frameworks like Sarbanes-Oxley leave to desire. It doesn't quite go a step far enough. And so I kind of just started probing more and seeing how I could get involved in like very early days of security assessments and just doing like what people might call like an external penetration test, and to include physical assessments and like, trying to war drive or like break into buildings in like a totally legal manner. That just kind of piqued my interest. I'm like, there's more here, and I want to go a bit further. Then I left public accounting. I actually went to Wachovia right before the merger with Wells Fargo, and I was doing third-party security assessments for all of their customers. So I like to learn a ton about how all these companies handled and dealt with bank data, like what they did for them, and that really kicked my security like kind of mindset into drive. After that was a contractor role, and after that role, I was like, I really want to stop asking questions and I want to push buttons. Like I want to do some of this work. So I had an opportunity to go jump into the engineering side of the world at First Citizens Bank, and from my previous boss who hired me at Wachovia. So I just said, yeah, I'll just basically reverse audit all these things until I learn it, and that's kind of how I got into security. And then like that was like a breakout role for me, and just cemented my love for security in all things in that space.
It's awesome. Funny story, and I actually remembered this as you were talking. I forgot you were in public accounting. My start was also because of SOX, and
Mm-hmm.
I was a finance major and graduated in 2009 when there was no jobs, and I thought I was taking a finance or accounting role, and I ended up taking an IT audit role. So I was auditing all of the people and what they were doing inside of the apps and databases. So that's similar to my start, although I didn't go nearly as technical as you. And now I'm on the evaluation of vendors and solution side. So, but that's awesome. For those of you who don't know, Mike writes a ton. I already mentioned Return on Security. You also write a lot about kind of the career path, if you will, or the job path to get into not only security, which I would say is where you spend most of your time, but IT in general. So over the last couple of years, I think that conversation has been coming up more and more about how to educate, what's the education path to get into security. So at this point, I'm going to kind of ask you live, for someone that is interested eventually in getting into security, whether they're a student right out of college and first job, or they're, midlife and want to switch into, IT or security, like what would you recommend to them? How do they get started at this point where we're at in 22?
Yeah, so that's a conversation that's actually pretty highly debated on the internet, like many things. But if you look at any other degree or any other career field, you have to get a degree in it to show you have a competence level in it, and you have to. That's a bare minimum expectation a lot of times to join certain parts of the workforce. But for many, many years, security was not like that. In fact, the people who were doing the hiring were actually anti-degree because they thought, well, there's nothing you can learn in a 4-year college setting or even a 2-year college setting that will be relevant into what you're going to be doing day to day in the security organization at a company. But what's interesting is that that's now shifting. So like as a certain demographic of the workforce is aging out or retiring, the people who are doing the hiring now are now the people who have degrees in cybersecurity. And so they have more esteem for that. They hold it in higher value. So if you had no other background in security today, I would say to go to get a degree to start, because if nothing else, it's a gate check. And
it's like a general cybersecurity degree, or is it specific?
Well, so I would say, start with just like a basic degree. Like, a lot of people who have already gone through undergrad are getting masters now in the program. And I would say just, wherever you're at on the undergrad versus grad side, focus in on that degree just to give you an orientation on like what is even covered in the field, because the education side has actually evolved tremendously. And now, really like when I've talked to many people who hire people in security, and a lot of them are not looking for a specific degree skill set, but they're looking for like people to understand the concepts and the approaches to security, which can be taught. And so, that's something that would be good for a classroom setting to help you all talk through concepts as Why is authentication important? Why is authorization important? Like, why should we talk about least privilege, or why should we make sure that applications don't get abused on the internet, and how can we prevent that? So these are like conceptual ways of thinking that can be packaged, and then you can then take those learnings and say, all right, now I have my full-time job day setting. How can I apply these learnings to this situation? And so I would say start there. And there's also, I would say, don't rely on just a degree, though. There is far too much free stuff on YouTube and far too much free stuff on GitHub that you can just learn just about anything you want. So I would tell people to go deep on a topic. So like, instead of trying to learn all of security at once, maybe you really are interested in security engineering, or maybe you're really interested in incident response. Try to learn as much as possible, like, about how that works and why that works, and then get the foundations of that instead of like focusing on a tool or focusing on like a particular framework. And that will help you get your, like, in the right mindset. You get your foot in the door.
Do you think it's an organization's responsibility to train and constantly train folks who are going into the security field and paying for it and basically coming up with the criteria for how you go through? Or do you feel that is on the individual to train on what they feel is relevant and kind of self-teach?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's got to be a mix of both, because one, as you know, most people who are in the field, like, they want to improve themselves in some way anyway. So there's like a constant learning, constant desire to kind of level up your skills in that aspect. And I think like you have to be that way if you're going to be in that field today, because it's already very hard to keep up with all the changing news, let alone the technology you need to like figure out how to secure these things. So I think people need to take it on themselves to do some of that. But I also think from a corporate standpoint, you need to kind of look at like, what would be the best level of education for people there in general. So like, common thing, this may be a hot take for some, but like paying for a bunch of people to go get their CISSP, like a very classic cert, probably not great for the employer, great for the employees, but instead sending them to go get AWS certified, that's probably more applicable if you're a cloud company who does a lot of work in AWS. Yes, they can use that elsewhere, but like, if you don't invest in them in that regard and make it specific to what your organization needs, then either they'll go somewhere that will give them that, or they just won't have the information. They won't be as prepared as they could be. So I think there's got to be a fine line of doing both, like company and person.
Right. So speaking of that, you mentioned Passport, very digital, footprint. I would say it's a tech company for all intents and purposes. Not that banks are not tech companies and financial, fintech, whatever you want to call it. They're just very different. So for you, let's talk specifically about, let's kind of dive into being a CISO and being in security. Like, how is security viewed differently in those two types of organizations? Like, maybe you'll start with defining, like, what is a CISO do? I mean, obviously it's security, but what does that mean all day for an organization? And then, like, what is the misconceptions between those, in those two organizations you deal with and you've seen?
Oh yeah, they're very, very different. No, it's a good one though, but they are very, very different. So CISO in general terms is like, they're the person who's setting the strategy and the direction on like how you're going to secure the business as a whole. And so that's kind of like just the broad swath of it. But really it's coming down to make sure you understand like, what does the business care about in terms of like, what is critical to make the business run? What data do we need to actually service our customers? And then how do you secure all the things around that and the pieces and components that actually serve customers or that people rely on today? And so that's, if you think about it from inside out, it's protecting like the company from inside, including employees, out to the world. And then from the outside in, like, what's the threats coming in to then affecting us as Passport customers or as employees. It's really an inside out and outside in kind of role in general. Now, where that changes between like large organizations, like banks in particular, or other highly regulated things is, typically when a company gets to any size, like IT is like a whole nation of itself. It's so big that it moves independently of the business, and the business moves independently of it, but not always in a positive way. And so it's so hard to coordinate across so many moving parts that typically those organizations just do whatever they want, and then let the fallout happen wherever it happens. And so, especially in highly regulated places, security is kind of they get to just do what they want. And there does not have to be a direct business impact or driver to what they're doing. And the fraud space is the exact same way. You can say, if I spend this much money, I can reduce this much risk. And so that sounds good. That sounds like it's a win no matter what. But really, like, you're in larger companies like that, more established companies, the products, there's so many products, so many different ways that the business works. You're just kind of bolting on security around existing things that people have to work with. And by and large, most people don't have a positive security experience with their banks as customers, but they just accept it because it's like, well, all my money's there, so I guess I deal with it.
I guess it's better than under the mattress.
Yeah. So there's a certain level of like people accept it as customers. There's a certain level of internal, even that people just accept. Well, that's security, so we have to do it because security is important, and that's just what we have to do. Now, like, contrast that with a product company, or contrast that with a company that does not have the same lens that financial services companies do, and you can't afford to operate that way because product is the whole reason you have a job there. And if that product didn't exist and you didn't service the customers, like, you wouldn't have a job. So, like, you have to be very methodical about how you help them securely deliver what they're doing. And it is a much more succinct piece of the product and the consumer journey, which to me is honestly the most appealing part, because it's when you're in a large organization, you often have zero knowledge about what your downstream impact is to the business side. And was it revenue impacting positively or negatively? You have no idea. You just exist to pontificate about security. You can't do that at like places like Passport or any other product kind of company like that. So, like, you have to be a lot more thoughtful and a lot more collaborative across all aspects. And your goal is to make the business as successful as possible, as securely as can, within the risks that they're allowing. And smaller companies have a higher risk tolerance than industries like banks and insurance companies who have like a zero risk tolerance kind of approach. So you have to be a little more artful in delivery.
Yeah. So you touched on something that I have heard recently as, I won't say an argument, right? But you talked about ROI on security. So obviously security is important. Turn on the news, turn on, any alerts you get, you're going to see within a couple minutes of some sort of breach or some fallout from breach. This past year, we've had a few major ones. But for an organization, I think sometimes security gets a bad rap because there is, in some people's eyes, no ROI. The only purpose is to prevent risk inside and out, and it's 100% prevention and then remediation if something happens. But there's not like an ROI to the business. Do you agree with that? And if not, like, help these listeners understand maybe where is the ROI outside of prevention and remediation for an organization?
That's a tough one because, a lot of cases, I would say 99% of cases, security teams don't have any kind of revenue impact. They're just a cost center. And
unless they're a security product, obviously.
Unless they're a security product, then it's like kind of a direct correlation. But what's interesting is, like, it's really hard to block all things. You can't prevent all risk. That's impossible. But the consumer expectations are so high that if you don't spend this money, then you're just negligent. So, like, it's not that it's just like a cost sink. It's more of a course of doing business. It has to be done, and you can't do business without it today, at least not very long. And so it's one of those things you have to be able to spin on its head and say, like, well, okay, knowing that it's maybe not a direct revenue driver, how can we then enable security to be a reason someone picks us? Like, how can we improve that process? And that's what I'm trying to do at Passport today. And, like, most of our customers are governments and DMVs, so they're extremely regulated, very particular about all their frameworks. And so I want to have our program in tip-top shape for them to the level they expect, such that they're like, okay, wow, that was actually really easy to deal with, you guys. Thanks for making that simple. And so I can, the way I'm trying to layer it in on Passport is, like, I'm trying to enable the RFP process and our customer outreach process to say, like, yeah, we do what you expect, but also we do more. And so check this out. We really take your privacy seriously. We do all these things for security above and beyond what we're being asked to do. Yes, that costs money, but there is, like, kind of almost a goodwill factor and such that you're creating, like, a reason for people to come and say, well, I like them better because, they're a security-minded organization or privacy-minded organization. So while there are, tools out there to kind of help you do a little bit of attribution in terms of, like, security helped sell this, or we helped close this deal, in some way, and maybe you get like a attribution Salesforce or something. But it's really just pat on the back. But like you have to do it, and like everyone knows the importance. I think truly, if I'm just being honest with it, it's like it's doing it internally and externally, such that you're just not like an inconsiderate group. Like you've got to think about the user experience. You've got to think about the people aspect of it, and you've got to make people want to do it. And then like some of those conversations about, oh, you just spend money, like they disappear when you make it nice and easy and simple or collaborative.
I agree with you. I mean, I've seen customers lose RFPs totally unrelated to what IT and security is in their organization, except for as part of the RFP, they have to answer security related questions, IT related questions, and they lose. They can't even put their name in for the RFP. And so I agree with you. I think it's good for people to understand that. Before we go into trends, because I'm very excited to talk to you about trends. By the way, I feel like Mike's going to be a couple times on this podcast because there's just so much trend analysis he does. But for the first time, let's talk basics. So before we get there, though, you've been in different types of organizations doing security. You just talked about the differences. Let's talk about like from a lens of, I don't know, a CFO, an accountant, a salesperson, someone who really doesn't have to deal with you. What's a misconception that people have about maybe IT in general, like what IT is for a big organization, and specifically security? Like, what are some of the misconceptions? Like, what do you think they don't understand that you wish you could just tell them?
I mean, I think a lot of times those groups just see IT in general as just like a big cost and it doesn't work or it doesn't get them what they need, or, because everyone has like a preference on like, how they want a system or how they want to operate. And a lot of groups see it just kind of like as a guard, as a barrier or as a guardrail, and they make work hard, and it should never be that way. So like, I wish that, I could tell them like, hey, if you feel that way, like bring it up a couple of levels and let's have a different conversation about like, what is it your group's not getting and how then can IT help you solve that, or how can security help you solve that? And I think a lot of those groups, IT and security groups, maybe they don't have the best feedback methods, or especially from business side, or maybe they find low value in feedback from the business because they can, in some large businesses, they're a business unto themselves and they just kind of do what they want. But I think, I'd say ask more often than you think is normal for those people to say, just go talk to them and like have a real question. If something's like a poor experience, tell us about it. Because most people, I'd say in general, want to help, but especially IT people and security people, they want to fix. They want to fix your problem. Give them the shot to fix it. And so like I think that's a big important piece that I wish they could say. Another piece is too, I'd say like no question is too small. Like especially on security, is something weird, let me know. I don't care how small it is. You got a weird text message, I want to know about it. Just because I'd rather you be in that mode of being forthcoming with the information and quick and collaborative with me, so I can say like, oh, you know what? I actually know this is a non-event. You can safely ignore it, or like, actually, I would have never known that until it was too late. Let me dig in a lot deeper on this. So I know sometimes they speak different languages, between, especially finance and accounting and business, and it's kind of hard to understand what the others are saying, and they miss each other a bit. But I'd say like just try to be more open. But that goes for the IT people as well. Like try to be more open and ask more.
It drives me crazy when I see projects, whether it's an initiative in finance or it's an initiative with some sort of product, and it's sure maybe not directly being driven by, security or IT like we talked about. But when you look at, call it the project committee or the steering committee, there's no one on IT or no one in security, at least not even once a month, or not, you're not in part of it. And then all of a sudden they get to the end, they get through it and they, ask IT to do things, but it's like, you should have them in there because they might be able to enable some of those things you're trying to do faster, easier, quicker by just knowing that. And so the good organizations, I think, view that as a part of the team versus just, like you said, break fix or whatever. And I'm sure security is even worse. I think sometimes I've heard terms like the CISO is just the person that says no. It's just, how do I get this past the CISO? It's like, well, there's a reason they do that. And you can look on the news and see why you might want to listen to them. So here's another kind of, it's a little tangent, but we talked about big organizations, security, IT. For folks out there that are part of smaller companies, 10 person, 15 people or whatever. And so, the big bureaucracy, that has nothing to do with them. But you could look at this online, but I'm curious your thoughts. Like where at the most basic form, if I'm starting my own little company and I want to make sure I'm secure, Like, what should I do in security to make sure that like the basics are covered, then at least most of the risk is gone off the bat?
Yeah, I'd say for a company like that, honestly, like don't try to do anything yourself is where I would start. I'd say stick with the basics. Like don't overcomplicate your business. Stick with like the Microsofts or the Googles of the world. Turn on every basic feature they tell you to turn on. Like turn on two-factor authentication in most places. Use SaaS apps and make sure they're always kind of authenticating through your Google or other authentication provider, because that those extra steps can help beat phishing attempts, which is going to be your most, it's still the most common attack in the world, for businesses of all sizes, and it's the easiest way to compromise a business or fraudulently move money. So like do some of those very basic things out of the way first, and rely on SaaS providers and service providers to help you do just a little bit more. Like you don't have to wing it all yourself in a spreadsheet and just slowly figure it out. Like the industry has come too far for companies of that size, like up to like the 100-person kind of range, like especially if you're cloud based, to have to do anything yourself. I would say look for those platforms that can help you just like lean into a compliance framework. Because if for nothing else, and although we know compliance is not security, but it is at least a roadmap, and it can at least give you some basic things that make you better off than and not negligent. It helps you get there, and then it can then help you secure other parts of your business as you go. So then you can focus on growing or making money and not having to run security as like a full-time job yet, because that time will come if you grow as a company, but you don't have to overthink it, is what I would say.
So let's go on the flip side. So now let's say Mike is going and you're taking over security for, let's say, a large organization, a couple thousand people. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is not no correlation, anything you've worked for in the past. So this is not insinuating any of the companies are not secure, but say that you walk in and it's a dumpster fire, like processes are bad, the tools are outdated and nothing's updated. The people are really not qualified. So you're now taking over as CISO, and someone says, Mike, get us secure. I've seen a lot of debates online, what depends. Security is about people, security is about process. It's not about tools, things like that. But I also have seen these same organizations get hacked because over time they can't get stuff figured out in time. So you walk into a situation like that, people, process, technology, it's all a mess.
Right.
What do you do first? Like, how do you start sleeping at night as a CISO in that type of organization? Like, where do you pull the triggers to get the most secureness, if you will, in an organization like that?
Wow, yeah, that's a tough one, and that's not an easy job. And I do not want that job, by the way.
Hopefully, no one has to take that. But I know that there are companies out there that just haven't focused on it.
Yeah, no, honestly, you'd have to start just doing like an inside-out kind of review of like, what is it that we actually have in terms of like the people, process, technology, to kind of do a thorough evaluation of like your talent at first. And then you also want to look to see like, what have we already committed to as a company, as an organization? Like, are we doing, which compliance frameworks are we looking at? Or which regulatory bodies do we have to answer to? What do our customers expect? And like basically reverse engineer, like what is the full scope of security at a company like that? Because I think that's where the nuance is going to come, is like security is going to look a bit different at most places, depending on your business model and depending on how many people you have, where IT sits, whether it's a sales driven organization or not. And so, but a thorough kind of vetting of like, what do I have? Take stock of what you have. Well, then, especially from a people standpoint, will help you determine like, all right, do I think based on what I've heard, based on what I've seen, do the people I have in the seat right now, are they the right ones to solve it? And if they are, why aren't they solving it? And if they're not, then we need to fix that. But rarely is it ever going to be let's buy a bunch of tools, and rarely is it simple enough to say, oh, we just got to fix a bunch of processes, because like that's kind of a nightmare in a big organization, because things are so ingrained into process and policy, even if they're not right, like they will be ingrained. So it's I would also suggest a company like that quickly hires an outside counsel or outside consulting firm to come give them a maturity assessment. And that way you can have the ability to lean on fresh eyes from another company's perspective who's seen a bunch of companies, presumably like yours, and then they can give you some focus areas to work on. And then you use that to determine what your risk levels are. And then that risk level and that I guess get better plan is going to drive your whole roadmap. Like that's what you're going to have to go back to your leadership with and say, here's where we are, here's where we need to be, and here's the delta between those things. In order to do that, we're going to have to invest in this kind of technology. We're going to need to hire this kind of people. Maybe we need to stand up our own, security operations center, or maybe we need to outsource it. But like without that kind of general assessment, it's going to be really hard for you just to make a gut call, especially when you're faced with all of those things happening at once. You're not going to know which dial to turn. And so you don't have to do it yourself is what I would say. So I'd quickly look to bring in that. And then also I would say on that same vein, like figure out how to do incident response, because if you don't understand how that process works, you're going to have to do it in an unfavorable position when it's a real deal. And then nobody wants that. Like nobody wants to know, that you don't know what you're doing at that point. I'd say focus on those two areas first, and then that will show you where a lot of failures happen, like process and tech and skill set. And then you'd have to just keep iterating on that, to be honest. But that could take years at a big company,
You sound very qualified to take a role like that, I'm going to be honest. But so we'll say you're not on the market for it. You mentioned right there at the end, iterating, and this will be kind of my last question before we wrap up with some of the trends, because that's what I know you're probably more interested in talking about anyways, but iterating. So like, say the company, we just described them, they're a mess, but like, let's say over the first year and a half or whatever, you do your assessments, you figure out your maturity, you start implementing, whether it's tools, processes, and or you hire the right people. You're working off an assessment that was done, let's just say 18 months ago. How frequently do you feel companies should get assessed? And is it the same full assessment like every 2 years, or can you do partial? Like I think people don't really understand assessments and the frequency of them.
Yeah, and it depends too, because some regulated industries require internal self-assessments, which is very subjective.
Yeah.
Many times. And so like, how can you really trust that some of the time? I think at a minimum, even for your audit committee or for regulatory filing reasons, like you should do an annual assessment of some sort. And it maybe not have to be like a full blown, below the doors off the place kind of assessment, but you should at least have an understanding at a strategic level and at like a capability level. And when I say capabilities, I mean like security capabilities. Like, do you have the ability to do incident response? Do you have the ability to contain a malware outbreak? And then what happens from that standpoint? Like, and do you have the ability to recover your assets? And do you have resiliency in the business? Like those things, you need to stay on top of that, like constantly. And so what often happens in large organizations, and this is where the challenge meets it, is that you have to spend multiple years fixing the sins of the past. And it's extremely hard to do the new things or fix the things that should be fixed, because you're filling up all your time with like large projects to solve like first principle problems that should have been solved long before anyone's time there. But for one reason or another, like businesses grow and as into like a Frankenstein monster, and then that's what you have. And so you're left to secure around that system that's like too big to fail. So getting that updated is going to be good. If nothing else, it'll help you have orientation about how you're tracking. So then you can report that to your executive team and to the board. And so you can then see, hey, are we spending our money in the right places still? Like have we improved, number one? And if, can we divert money to different places or focus on different areas? And it'll give you an idea of like how the outside competitor set is doing on that as well. So, adding that in with like, hey, this is a very common exercise in banking where banks would pay an external search firm to help them understand how much money other banks were spending on security as a part of IT budget every year. There's value in that, just so you understand, like they're growing at X rate, we're growing at X rate. If they're a 5,000, IT person company and we're a 2,000 IT person company, this gives me an idea of where my budget probably should be in relation to theirs in terms of spending. So that helps. It's not always like this. It's not always like a rubric you have to follow, but it gives you an idea of like, am I keeping pace with customer expectations and industry expectations? It's one of those things like you should look to try to do iterations at the smallest level possible outside of like these assessments. So like if your incident response team can do an after action report after every incident that happens and they get better each time, that's progress. Like if your engineering team figures out ways to like make the software deployment process or the image creation process or the server imaging process simpler, easier, faster, like that's a win. So like you have to encourage that and like set the tone at the top of that as a CISO though, out in the organization, that's the kind of outcomes you need, because once you start iterating on that, you'll create a good flywheel, and then you'll start to slowly catch up in areas and even surpass places where you expect it to be. And so that it really comes about controlling your energy and controlling where you can turn the dials up at that point. It's like kind of very little about security and more about like, all right, where can I make the incremental and tangent, like general progress?
It's like get 1% better each day that applies very much. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very much a security kind of mantra. So like if you're interviewing for security, like say those words, because like that's good. Like that people like that. You want to fight the good fight and play the long-term game with long-term people. That's positive.
There you go. Free advice on how to interview.
Yes.
Okay, so a couple questions before we go. So switching gears kind of. So you write, return on security funded. You write about companies that are getting funded. You gain a lot of insights, and we gain a lot of insights from seeing, okay, like last week I emailed you and said, holy crap, I can't believe they just got $500 million of funding for this tool. But I'm curious, like right now with 2022, we're filming this May 6th. Sorry, I can't even remember the month. What are you seeing for the rest of 2022? Like if you're going to go on, I don't know, some show on CNBC or MSNBC about the, forecast for 2022, what is the security tool hot trend forecast for 22 that you're seeing, and what people are investing in? What do you think you're going to see more attacks, breaches on, just general trends in security for the remainder of this year?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple key trends that are happening this year that have already kind of started early in the year, but that will just increase. Anything related to IoT and operational technology is just going to continue to skyrocket. The Russia-Ukraine situation exacerbated that, and there's been a big need for that now because people realize just how insecure and vulnerable critical infrastructure is, or public works, or like, city water systems or sewage systems. Like, it's scary. Like how old the technology is that runs all these services and how immature or non-existent security is around it, or even IT. Like some of these systems don't even have IP addresses, if you can believe it. So like some of them are, it's scary to think like what could happen and the potential human impacts of that. So like anywhere in that space that crosses the physical and cyber security kind of realm, we're going to be a continuing huge investment spot.
Is there, let me ask you really quick on that. Is there, so you said Russia, Ukraine, it's pointing out a lot of maybe inefficiencies or inadequacies. Is there something else though that's driving it besides just more monitoring and IoT being better technology? Or is there another like breach or attack that you would point to that you think is causing people to focus on it more?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's been a couple local cases in states in the U.S. where people are attacking water treatment systems. Like I think that happened more than once in Florida. So yeah, like it is becoming more opportunistic. Either they're driven via nation states or they're driven via just like individuals who are just like looking to cause like some form of chaos. But the world is getting more volatile in some ways, and so I would expect there to be like repercussions in a different manner, or like even like domestic terrorism in some way happening through cyber methods as well as physical methods. So I think it's a continuing trend. And obviously the intelligence agencies are also kind of heavily tuned into that as well, but that's a growing kind of area of concern. But I think people are just now also just kind of realizing that just how fragile some of these systems are. Or even just look at, what happened in like Texas when they had the big winter storm and their power grid just failed. And that was just a Mother Nature caused thing. And it probably wouldn't be that difficult from a technology standpoint to make that happen again. And so, like, how do you build more resilient cities and grids in light of climate change, in light of all these other external factors, in addition to human factors in like tech? So I think a lot of that's being driven by like a multitude of forces.
Gotcha. So IoT security is huge. What else are you seeing, and what else do you think people are going to be asking about buying in 22, and why?
So software supply chain security is another major topic, or you might hear software bill of materials or SBOM. If you look back at the SolarWinds breach and how the attackers injected themselves into the code delivery process for SolarWinds. So they got like a bad actions set inside legitimate software, and that's how they were able to compromise everything. Before like understanding like what libraries you use or what third-party services, open source or otherwise, that you use, like it was never that much of a concern because it was never turned against them as an attack vector. And there's now increasing, again, it goes back to the Russia-Ukraine situation. I forget the exact term for it, where people are protestware. So people are now injecting geographic specific attacks, or like maybe they're disabling the service based on where a person pulls the repository from, or where the repository goes. And so they can say, hey, we don't support what you're doing. So now what you're doing to Ukraine. So we've now disabled the software in your country. And corporations can't stop that because many of the things that run like corporate software, or like enterprise software, is run on open source software managed by like one or two people.
Right.
So like, how do you safely ingest software and use it for commercial use all around the world is a challenge. I think the concept of treating all software that the company itself did not create as hostile will become like a kind of pervasive thought. So like there's only like certain repositories they can come from, and they're all copies of the original, and the originals are inspected to an nth degree before they're allowed to be into the organization's copy.
I assume these are in, you're speaking, these are enterprise technologies, because we haven't seen these necessarily as much in the mid-market space. Do you think it's coming? And for these maybe people that are sitting here listening for a 150 person company, what can they do if they can't afford like a software supply chain technology or investment to review?
Yeah, I'd say it is coming for the small mid-sized market. I would say my general advice, business advice, would be don't roll the software on your own if you can do it with a SaaS product. Like let somebody else handle that. But if you have to bring in the software, if you have to develop it yourself, and you don't have the means to like kind of interrogate the software lifecycle around that, it's going to be a challenge, because the attackers have proven like it doesn't actually matter the size of the organization or like necessarily the monetary value associated with them. There often will be opportunistic. So if they can find that a small business uses a particular piece of software that they can exploit, they'll try to exploit you and everybody else who uses it. And so that it's more of a casting a wide net. And even just the last 5 years, small medium businesses have realized that they're not safe from the net anymore, the attacker net. So I'd say it's like just be smart and try to get a better handle on how your developers are bringing in software. And so the concept of like, many startups are kind of built off of like a combination of many different softwares, and that can lead to like kind of again goes back to like the Frankenstein set of systems. But if you can streamline on like, we only develop in Go, or we only develop in this form of JavaScript or these types of libraries, you can limit your blast radius a little bit, but you're still going to be dependent on those upstream systems and updates. So having like a strong technology team or a strong developer team who can understand like the risks and trade-off of delivery is going to be really hard. And I won't even lie, like it's going to be hard to do, especially when you're in the mode of growing. And so it's something that I think that will cascade down. But in the same turn, I think the commoditization of that kind of software is going to get cheaper. And so it's going to be easier. It seems
like it could scale because, an enterprise would review a vendor, and once you review one once, it feels like you could push that down to others. And I could see that over time getting less expensive for mid-markets.
Yeah, I think so, especially if you leverage any of these like cloud-hosted code repository platforms like your GitHubs or your GitLabs. And like there's often things that like the tech industry as a whole kind of has to like level up. Like back when Amazon Web Services was out, every other day you'd see a breach in the news from a company who just didn't configure AWS correctly. And like over time, they built in either checks to say like, hey, this isn't configured correctly, you should turn this on, or they default activated some of these services so you don't shoot yourself in the foot. So I think there needs to be a broader kind of lift of like industry level, same way that Microsoft like forces updates to computers everywhere now. You can't opt out of it because they know the attack surface they bring. So they have to, as like a general public service, they have to do the right thing for the world.
My computer was trying to restart about 5 minutes ago. That's why I was looking down to the corner, and I was like, no, don't do it right now. Wait till tonight.
Now.
So
yeah.
Do you see any, so like relating current trends, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but like, in the United States, inflation is kind of a big topic right now. Inflation, people are speculating maybe a recession, et cetera. Do you see any security risk that will come out of that?
Well, I think money is always like a driver for these types of, for anything, for any kind of attack. And then that's what drives most cyber attacks in the world. So like, it would not surprise me if like there was an increase in phishing or like business fraud related things around inflation relief or like some kind of debt relief, or these attackers are always very opportunistic, but like that happens with any news cycle. Like there's always going to be attacks related to those kinds of things. I'd say that people are probably going to, and on the investment side, people are probably going to stop investing on super new or like untested technologies as much. Like it'll still happen, but I've already seen this year that there's been an uptick in acquisitions, way more so than last year already. And I think that's largely due to the fact that like investors are a bit nervous with where the market's going and a bit nervous with their money, but they still have a lot of money to deploy. So they try to look for ways to like make safer bets and make safer acquisitions. And so it's, why not acquire a business that's already making a lot of capital as opposed to trying, a seed or Series A round on this startup that may or may not make it through this, downturn. So I think there's kind of like those typical things have fallen out that'll happen, but even still, like there's no slowdown in like overall funding. Like it's still picking up. It's still going extremely fast. Like I think I just looked, I keep a leaderboard of sorts, but there's already been like $7 billion funding like just this year already, just in what I've been tracking, and like $29 billion in acquisitions. So it's definitely not slowing down.
Yeah.
It's just shifting.
Well, and I will say, like, we'll have a whole nother episode dedicated to, the funding and why and how. And for the sake of time, I want to let you go. I want to let the listeners go. So for my final question, it's the question I ask everyone. So, we've been talking a lot about security, big organization, small, how to secure. So Mike Privette gets to give a State of the Union. He's speaking to multi-million people because everyone's going to come out and see you. What do you tell them? Like, what's the message you would want to tell the most number of people, whether it's personal, about cybersecurity, IT, career? What would you tell them?
Man, that's a broad. If I had this kind of audience, man, I don't know what I'd say.
We'll say the common man or woman.
Yeah, I would say be wary of what you're trading off for like ease of use, like just kind of in general, like be more vigilant than you think you should be. You can't get some of this stuff back. So like, once your information and data is out there, your best bet is just kind of limit the blast radius of it. So just be careful and be aware of like kind of the trade-offs, and that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So like think about that when you're doing.
One of my customers has that as a t-shirt, by the way. So maybe I'll wear that the next time. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Yeah, that's I think people are generally more aware, but I'd say like don't stop now, keep it up.
Yeah, that's good advice. Well, Mike, thank you for joining the show. For the listeners out there, thank you for joining. We look forward to having you on again. Thank you for all the writing that you put out to the world. If you have not, or you do not subscribe today, I highly recommend subscribing to Mike's newsletter, Return on Security, Security Funded. We will put it in the show notes. Mike, thanks again. Have an awesome rest of the week. Have an awesome rest of the week to the listeners out there. And we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for listening. The IT Matters podcast is produced by Upcalla, an IT advisory firm that helps businesses navigate the vast and complex IT marketplace. Learn more about Upcalla at opkalla.com.